Yeah, you thought it was a simple question, didn't you?
No, I knew it wasn't going to be.
Okay, so with that note, Hanukkah Sameach, happy Hanukkah to everyone. I hope you're enjoying your first day of Hanukkah and get ready for candle number 2 tonight. We're not here to talk about Hanukkah. As I mentioned just a minute ago, if you're interested, you can check out my Pathway to Judaism class from last week, where we did talk about Hanukkah for some more interesting details. Now that the commercial is done, we're on to your regularly scheduled program, which is Parashat Miketz. We're going to go into the dream world. I should point out that we've been dealing with dreams now for quite some time. We started the Joseph cycle with dreams. We ended last week's parasha with the dreams of the butler and the baker. And now we are going to begin this parasha with dreams. I should also point out that there are many opinions in many different places that say dreams often will have a prophecy, and some dreams, like the ones we're dealing with here, have a lot more than just a drop. That there is much more content to it. So the question of what are we supposed to make of these dreams, how do we interpret them, what does interpreting them mean, is going to be much of what occupies us this morning. Good? Okay, so page 250. I'm going to move this over here since I had to adjust the tripod. 250, we're on chapter 41, verse 1. All right. Well, you know, if the bug sits on the wrong place, I read the different vowel. Are you volunteering?
I will volunteer.
Okay.
After 2 years' time, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile.
Pardon? Wait, 2 years out. 2 years after what?
Joseph's in jail.
He's
forgotten. He's alone.
Okay, so Joseph's in jail. Right. So remember, he was in jail after his accusation with Mrs. Potiphar. And he is now hanging out there. He meets the baker and the butler, and he interprets their dreams. Baker dies, but the butler, he says, or the cupbearer, when you go back to Pharaoh, remember me to him, which means don't just talk about how great my story was, but see if you can do something about getting me out of here, because butler and even cupbearer is a misnomer. These are not just servants in the sense of the guy who shows up with your glass. The cupbearer would have been an official title for a very high-level courtier that would be responsible for advising Pharaoh, not just pouring his cups. So it's a title that perhaps gets lost on us because we're not used to that kind of courtly world. But you know, keeper of the king's cups is not the guy who wipes them down. Keeper of the king's cups would be somebody that was very important in the king's courtroom.
No, nothing special.
Probably, actually, the baker probably was special as well. So the recipes for ancient bread, the procedures for doing yeast, numerous other things were also considered to be very important state secrets in some cases, but also just important political things. Or on the other hand, it could simply have been in charge of Pharaoh's bread, which doesn't mean they were the ones baking it, but they had that honorary title that showed that they were helping the king, and then messed up. What's that?
They represent bread and
they represent bread and sustenance, exactly. So
it could mean something.
It could, and if we knew more about ancient Egyptian politics, that would probably help. But we know, at least from European politics, giving people titles that were connected to supplying the king didn't mean they were the ones who were actually bringing the bread, but it meant that they were of a certain rank within the hierarchy. Think of it like Duke and Earl and stuff like that. Make sense? Okay, yeah, I know it's one of the ways that language can get in the way of us understanding. All right, so 2 years after. So he's been in jail now for 2 years, which means the cupbearer did not exactly run back to Pharaoh and tell him about the guy in jail. On the other hand, although this may elicit for us certain feelings of unfairness, you know, because after all, Joseph helped him. Did Joseph help him? Right? I mean, what did Joseph do?
He provided encouragement.
He provided encouragement. And if he hadn't provided encouragement, would there have been any difference of outcome? is going to be becoming a bit of a thread, which is why I'm trying to tease it out now, right? If Joseph had done nothing, the cupbearer had come in and said, I had this really terrible dream. I don't know what to make of it. And Joseph went, would the cupbearer still have been restored? And would the baker still have been executed? Or was Joseph somehow instrumental in not just encouraging him to hang in there, guy, it's only 3 more days, somehow influencing the outcome?
No, he did influence the outcome, but he planted a seed for.
So you're saying he didn't actually, his interpretation was not instrumental, but Joseph, in giving his interpretation, wasn't helping the cupbearer, he was helping himself.
Right.
Ultimately, by giving his encouragement, we then see that it pays off.
Which would seem to indicate then that interpreting dreams doesn't help the dreamer, it only helps the interpreter.
In this case, yes.
I mean, what difference would it make for the cupbearer if Joseph had not interpreted it? The only person that's really helped, or we know because we've read the book ahead, spoilers, is Joseph, because now Joseph has an opportunity to go interpret the dream for someone else, which if it follows the same pattern, will be of no benefit to the person that dreamt it. It'll only be a benefit because Joseph gets, position. But if Joseph had not interpreted Pharaoh's dream, would there have been a difference?
Yes.
Yeah, still would have been the, but they wouldn't
Yes.
have been able to anticipate storage,
Right.
But here's how his interpreting helps him.
Mm-hmm. Helps the baker or helps Joseph?
Help Joseph.
Well,
He knows it's a gift from God.
right.
The fact he's able to do it should help his faith in waiting this 2 years.
So you mean it gave Joseph encouragement
That
because
also
he knew that God had given him the opportunity to plant a seed that would get him out of jail,
But he knows he has this gift from God.
right?
And that means God is still with him. And so even though he's forgotten, he's in prison, he's sitting there for 2 years in the darkness, feeling alone, he knows he still has hope because he has this gift.
This would be a great song right at the end of a first act of a musical,
Right.
right?
Right.
The Technicolor Dreamcoat, that's exactly what Joseph is singing at the end before the second act begins. But why would Joseph know that God was with him in the first place? Why would he have hopes and aspirations? Shouldn't he be crushed?
He should be. And after a year of sitting in the dark in jail with nothing happening, he's not dreaming about people bowing down to him.
He's not dreaming about that, but do you think he's forgotten those dreams?
That's interesting. I
Right.
would see he'd be pretty depressed
I
sitting
think-
there.
And he's pretty depressed sitting there, and then along comes somebody with a dream that's connected to Pharaoh or his own dreams.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, think about where you are if you're Joseph at this point. Right? You have been sold into slavery, your dreams of ruling over your family are gone, and now all of a sudden a dreamer comes to you and you see in them a glimmer of hope. That might have been rather stirring for somebody who was known as the dreamer back in the day, as we're going to see many years prior. Okay, but let's go ahead and get to the dream of the day.
So it's 2 years later. Pharaoh is standing by the Nile. He's dreaming, but he's standing by the Nile. When out of the Nile, 7 cows, handsome and sturdy, and they grazed in the reed grass. But presently, 7 other cows came up from the Nile, close behind them, ugly and gaunt, and stood beside the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 handsome, sturdy cows. Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, solid and healthy, grew on a single stalk. But close behind them sprouted 7 ears, thin and scorched by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 solid and full ears. Then Pharaoh awoke. It was a dream.
Wait. Pardon?
Oh.
So you're right, great exclamation point there. But what did he say it was?
A dream.
But he's wrong, isn't he? How many dreams did he have?
2.
So why does he say it was a dream?
it was part 2 of the same dream.
Oh.
This is going to be a point that will be why Joseph is able to prove his worth to Pharaoh. right? Why would Pharaoh accept his interpretation over those of his other advisors and wonder workers? Is because Joseph was able to see what Pharaoh intuitively knew, that it was one dream. It looks like two dreams. After all, he was asleep, he woke up, he was asleep, he woke up. And there are different content in the dreams. Just because we've read the book so many times and we know what Joseph is about to say, we feel spoiled that we can so clearly see what all this means. But apparently not everybody in Egypt could tell that, and that isn't because they were all dummies. They did build the pyramids. They were kind of clever. They could have figured this out if it was self-evident and they hadn't already read the book like the rest of us. I mean, really, can you ever remember being young enough that you don't know what these dreams mean? Like when you first heard these stories and you had no idea what this was going to be? No, none of us can remember that because we've been told these stories every year of our lives. And that's why it seems self-evident to us, but it wasn't to them. What's that?
I said, I don't even remember it from last year.
You don't remember from last Nicely said. But the narrator tells us this is one dream, and it is only when Joseph shows up that we get that confirmation that this is in fact one message. And we'll come back to that. But I just wanted to draw that to your attention before we lost our place. All right, so continuing on verse 8 of chapter 41.
Next morning, Pharaoh's spirit was agitated, and he sent for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but none could interpret them for Pharaoh.
Did you notice, by the way, that we're in plural now?
Yeah.
Right, the narrator says it was a dream. Pharaoh says dreams. Right, so keep going.
The chief cupbearer then spoke up and said to Pharaoh, I must make mention of my offenses. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and placed me in custody in the house of the chief steward, together with the chief baker. We had dreams the same night, he and I, each of us a dream with a meaning of its own. A Hebrew youth was there with us, a servant of the chief steward. And when we told him our dreams, he interpreted them for us, telling each of us the meaning of his dreams. And as he interpreted for us, so it came to pass. I was restored to my post, and the other was impaled.
All right, so wonderfully nuanced and diplomatic speech here. So I've got to talk about something that's not so pleasant, right? Which again reminds us perhaps why he wasn't keen to mention the dreamer when he was in prison. When he first got back to Pharaoh, oh, Pharaoh, thank you for restoring me. I never had any doubt because, you know, there was this guy who told me while I was in prison, remember I was in prison because I had done whatever I did that offended you? Yeah, you don't want to remind the guy who just let you out of prison that you were in prison for some reason.
Is he bringing his guilt to remembrance by reminding Pharaoh about his, I was in custody?
No.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That
I mean,
becomes a theme later on about bringing his guilt to remembrance.
exactly. How many people do you know of who have ever served time in prison talk about what they learned in prison? Even if it was constructive, right? I mean,
my name is so-and-so. I was in prison.
like, so you're fixing, the pipes, and the person says, oh, that's great. Where'd you learn to do plumbing? Oh, I did a course on plumbing when I was in prison. How many people would just let that drop? Right. Yeah. Most people would say, oh yeah, my grandfather taught me, I studied it online at YouTube. They're going to avoid mentioning where they learned the skill. And here he has no choice but to mention precisely where he learned it. So yes, and then of course by downgrading this youth, he's also taking care of the second offense, which is if there was somebody who was so keen and skilled at interpreting dreams, why have you not brought them to my attention before? Why not? Because he was a Hebrew, which were not exactly liked in the land of Egypt, because he was a youth, right? He wasn't even a man, although at this point he certainly would have been a man and no longer just a na'ar in the classical definition of youth. And also because he was also a slave. Right? They mitigate it with servant here of Potiphar, but he was a slave and he's in prison, right? So of course I wasn't going to mention this first off to Pharaoh. So please don't be upset with me that I haven't mentioned this before now. So he's taking care of both of his offenses, reminding Pharaoh of his past offense and also his offense of omission, of not bringing to Pharaoh's attention this talented person prior to this.
Who happens to be a kid and a slave and a Hebrew.
Well, that's his excuses.
No matter what.
But that's his excuses of why he hadn't mentioned them.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, I didn't mention him to your mightiness and highness and all of that because he was just a Hebrew, a slave, a kid, and in prison.
A huge risk.
Yes, he is. And the only reason he's doing this is because he can see A, Pharaoh's agitation, B, that Pharaoh's not accepting other answers, and C, this is a golden opportunity to cash in. Right? If you become the guy who helped Pharaoh and the guy, not that he knows it entirely yet, who helps the guy who helps Pharaoh, who then ends up being second to Pharaoh, boy, are you in a good position.
Yeah.
Right? You are set for life. And so he mentions Joseph finally. Okay, so let's get to the interpretations.
Thereupon,
Yeah, 14.
Thereupon, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was rushed from the dungeon. He had his hair cut and changed his clothes, and he appeared before Pharaoh.
By the way, this is now the third major clothing incident in the life of Joseph.
Yes.
Right? The first was off, on and off of his lovely gown, the katonet we talked about a little bit before. The second was when Mrs. Potiphar was involved in a wardrobe malfunction.
Yeah.
And now the third is where he rises up in stature before Pharaoh. And there's going to be another where he gets not just cleaned up, but actually invested with royal type garments. Onward.
And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, but no one can interpret it. Now I have heard it said of you that for you to hear a dream is to tell its meaning. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, not I. God will see to Pharaoh's welfare. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile when out of the Nile came up 7 sturdy and well-formed cows and grazed in the reed grass. Presently, there followed them 7 other cows, scrawny, ill-formed, and emaciated. Never had I seen their likes for ugliness in all the land of Egypt.
And by the way, notice that's Pharaoh's interpretation of his own dream. That wasn't in the original content. The never have I seen, right? You've never seen cows like this before line wasn't in the original. So he's already coloring the dream, and he clearly has got ideas about something about this dream. And he's not 100% sure, but it is influencing his retelling. There are some other subtle differences, which we're not going to have time to go into, but I encourage you to read through, especially if you can manage the Hebrew, to see some of the gradations between the original dreams and his recounting of the dreams.
And the 7 lean and ugly cows ate up the first 7 cows, the sturdy ones. But when they had consumed them, no one could not tell that they had consumed them, for they looked just as bad as before. And I awoke. In my other dream, I saw 7 ears of grain, full and healthy, growing on a single stalk. But right behind them sprouted 7 ears, shriveled, thin, and scorched by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed the 7 healthy ears. I have told my magicians, but none has an explanation for me.
Okay, so the dreams are out there. Now, all of us are rushing to say, 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine.
Right.
And, it's all so
We're
obvious,
so smart.
right? Because the numbers in dreams, that always means years, right?
Oh.
What did it mean for the baker and cupbearer? Days. What did Joseph and his brothers think the number of stars meant in Joseph's dreams?
That was
Themselves.
The people,
The people.
right? So we're all going, oh yeah, it's 7 years, we got this. Again, we are so prejudiced because we've read this before. You could imagine that the wizards and others of Egypt would have said, Pharaoh will have 14 children, right? There will be 7 that are sturdy, but then there will be 7 that will follow. There will be 7 dynasties of strength for Pharaoh, and then there will be 7 dynasties that follow later, almost like a certain statue in the book of Daniel that talks about different successive kingdoms becoming weaker and weaker. There's so many other interpretations to these things than just 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So don't rush to think you know what this means. But Joseph does, which is good, because otherwise it would have been really bad for our nation. Not that this doesn't present other challenges to our people, end up becoming slaves, but it was also a lifeline during a horrible famine. Okay, next verse.
And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same.
As I mentioned before, Joseph is able to see these aren't 2 different dreams. These are one dream. Doesn't matter that they look different. They're really just one.
God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows are 7 years, and the 7 healthy ears are 7 years. It is the same dream. The 7 lean and ugly cows that follow are 7 years, as are also the 7 empty ears scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I have told Pharaoh what he is about to do. Immediately ahead are 7 years of great abundance in all the land of Egypt. After them will come 7 years of famine, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. By famine, no trace of the abundance will be left in the land because of the famine thereafter, for it will be very severe. As for Pharaoh having had the same dream twice, it means that the matter has been determined by God and that God will soon carry it out.
Okay, so he's explaining the doubling as having a particular meaning in this case, which is urgency, right? It's the question we should have had is, if these are the same dreams, why didn't he just dream about the cows twice? Why didn't he just dream about the grain twice? And he's saying, no, the doubling of the dream was to show the urgency from multiple points of view, to really try and ring Pharaoh's bell, to really try to get him to wake up to understand this issue. And indeed, he was agitated, but he couldn't understand what it meant. So that's how Joseph is handling this issue of why 2 if they're really just 1. Make sense? Okay.
Accordingly, let Pharaoh find a man of discernment and wisdom and set him over the land of Egypt.
Wait a minute. Are we still interpreting?
No, that was
Yeah.
motion.
Right? Is this interpret or is this advice?
Motion.
This is advice. You're all perfectly happy with your answer.
That's advice.
What?
Okay.
So what Joseph is saying here has nothing to do with the content of the dream, but has to do with his understanding of agriculture and national management.
He's doing this for the welfare of the land where he is.
Oh, absolutely, but
Yeah.
where does he get the idea?
Well, he's been a shepherd too. He's had experience with living on the land and
Absolutely.
stuff.
Absolutely. So this is what I'm trying to raise to your attention. This is a machloket, a point of dispute among the commentators, which is this paragraph Joseph improvising advice to Pharaoh based upon what he has just seen or interpreted from Pharaoh's dream? Or is this Joseph reading the signs in the dreams to say, the dream is telling me that this is what is necessary?
I think he's reading the signs.
Yeah.
He's kind of jumped ahead to the end of saying, we can avert this. We can.
Well, it's not averting the fact,
Not
we would
averting
deal.
it,
Okay.
But we can deal with it.
Which, if you look carefully at the dream, is precisely what the dreams say.
Yeah.
Right?
because
We all think about the dreams as being the devastation of the famine. But in the dream, the skinny cows do remain, right? And they remain because they eat from the other cows, right? They are sustained by the cows that came before them. It isn't there are 7 cows and then they drop dead, and then there are 7 skinny cows. It's there are 7 cows that are then consumed by the skinny cows. And the skinny cows are still skinny, but they're not dead, right? Which means the famine will be supported by the plenty of the years of abundance.
And just same with the grain.
I see.
And so too with the grain, exactly. With the cows, it's a little easier for us to visualize because we can imagine skinny cows and that better than we can grain because most of us aren't farmers. But cows we can picture, I think, more clearly. But you're right, for the grain, it's exactly the same metaphor, which is the abundance will sustain the time of famine.
If you do it right.
Well, and so now is the question of, if Joseph hadn't interpreted, what would have happened in Egypt? Would they have come through this okay, or would they not?
No, they
Wow.
they needed that person to say,
Their forgetfulness also jumps up here because they will have forgotten the years of plenty.
Right.
And that's another warning that he is interpreted, that people have forgotten the plenty and there will be this famine. That is a warning. That's political instability.
Certainly, which would alarm Pharaoh. But it's very easy to still eat and forget what it was like to have lots. So, during World War II, when people were being on rationing, right, people still They didn't starve to death in this country, but they could not really remember what it was like to just eat whatever they felt like, as they did right before the war or before the Depression, depending upon how far back you have to go in your family to find easy access to food. But they would not have been starving to death. They would have been under severe rationing. And so the forgetfulness could still have been there even without Joseph. But what this dream seems to be indicating, which is why Joseph is bringing it to the forefront in here, and he's not just being a pushy little nudnik and promoting himself, it has already revealed to you in your dream what is necessary, which is that the planning has to happen. And that is why God gave you this dream in this way, in order that it come through a vision that no one else could interpret except the guy who's going to help you.
And who would be the first to suffer in the event of famine? The prisoners.
Yeah, you do tend to cut back on food for prisoners during famine.
Yeah, so there is an element of self-interest still, because his own life has value, so he has an interest in doing this.
Right. All right, so we're just going to shoot ahead here a little bit. Just jump down to verse 3, if you could.
Verse 3.
The plan pleased. Oh, 37, sorry.
37.
Man, new glasses.
Oh,
The plan pleased.
The plan pleased Pharaoh and all his courtiers. And Pharaoh said to his courtiers, "Could we find another like him, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made this all known to you, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my court, and by your command shall all my people be directed. Only with respect to the throne shall I be superior to you."
All right, so we're going to pause there and then get the handouts going. But this idea that Pharaoh turns to the other assembled people and say, all right, so he didn't say who we should get, but clearly God sent me this dream in this way with all of its implications so that this man would come before me. And that was a clear sign as any that this is the person God wants me to pick to be in charge. Don't you all agree? And before listening for an answer, he moves on, right? Like any good executive, you just surround yourself with yes men. Okay, so let's see how we handle this dream and the interpretation and how it all fits together or doesn't fit together. So we are on Sforno at the top. Seeing.
Sforno, yes.
Yeah.
Seeing that God has seen fit to inform you of the impending famine, no doubt in order to afford you an opportunity to ameliorate its effect on your people. And he has also shown you that this famine will be preceded by 7 years of extraordinarily abundant harvests. You not to become guilty in his eyes if you were to ignore such warning.
All right, so typical Sforno faction, it's a little bit overcomplicated into many negatives. But what he's basically trying to say is, look, God has shown you what's coming. God has shown you how to fix what's coming. If you don't fix what's coming, right, if you ignore the warnings and refuse to prepare in the face of so obvious of signs, then that's an actual transgression, which will lead to devastation to your country. Right? Being willfully stupid is a sin. It's a sort of the short phrase of this, right? If to quote Daniel again, if the handwriting is on the wall, then you need to be able to read it.
This is also like in Ezekiel, when Ezekiel is appointed to be a sentinel for Israel.
Mm-hmm.
If I put a word in your mouth and tell you to tell the people and you don't, then their blood is on your hands.
Right. You have to do this. That's why God is telling this. It's not could have the granaries or you could not. It's you must do this in order to save your country. And if you do not, it's not choosing to restrain yourself from helping your nation. You are dooming your nation and therefore guilty. It's casting the advice that Joseph is giving as less advice and more straight up interpretation that the dream is telling you what God wants you to do, which is make this happen. Get this in place so that the devastation doesn't happen. All right. Rabbeinu Bachia gives a little bit more of a point on that.
Joseph meant that there was now a need for a discerning and wise man to be appointed as being in charge of the land of Egypt.
Right. So, of course, they needed wise people before. And, of course, people were in charge of things before. But what Rabbeinu Bachia is saying is that Joseph's interpretation of the dream, again, not his advice and just self-servingness, but his interpretation is not to put himself forward, but to say, right now, this is when you need your best and brightest. right? Because you are about to face an opportunity which would usually negate the need for the best and brightest, right? Well, think about it for a second. If you are living in a country and the economy is just going full tilt, and in those days that means grain is just pumping out of all your fields, so much so that you can't even, eat it. Do you need wise and careful leadership? It's good, right? Who needs a wise and discerning leader when everything's good? You only need wisdom when it's all in the toilet and you need someone to help pull you out of there. And what Joseph is saying is, no, despite that you only need wisdom when you're in trouble, having wisdom is the way to avoid trouble. And if you use the years that are about to come, then you won't end up in the famine toilet and you won't need to have all that whole horrible catastrophe.
Plan ahead?
Yes, planning when it's good. And that is the chiddush. That's the novelty of what Joseph is interpreting here. And it's the novelty that God is trying to instruct to Pharaoh, that you can plan ahead and use the good years to soften the bad years. And that you shouldn't be cavalier just because things are good. But I mean, come on, for all of us, how often are we more careful with our last dollar than we are with our first dollar? It's at the end of the month, all of a sudden we're looking at the prices of whatever we're buying in the supermarket. At the beginning of the month, not so much. Right? And that's exactly what Joseph is trying to say. Plan for the entirety of it, not just for how you feel at the moment, not just for where you are today. And that's a pretty good piece of advice all around. All right. So then we look at some of the particulars of that plan. Yes.
Onkelos translates it. And prepare, mesh, does not mean taking a fifth, as scripture mentions, only gathering, which is the preparation.
All right. So Siftei Chachamim is trying to clear up something. And perhaps, because there's a number of people who try to help with this, but I chose one of the shorter ones, and maybe I chose the shortest one correctly, because he said it was confusing. So we have this word chimesh, which is what Joseph uses as his advice. And the problem is the word chimesh is unclear of what it means in Hebrew. It can either come from the word chamesh, which means a fifth, right? Which would be, take 20%, which is often talked about in scholars and other commentators to say that is more than the usual tax of 10%, right? If the years are good, you tax more in order that when the years are bad, you don't have to tax as much because there's not as much to tax. It's you tax where the money is, if you will, rather than taxing to get yourself out of the deficit, trouble, problem, famine that you've got, because that doesn't work. So the chimesh is often translated as that, but it could also mean quite easily by the use of that same root in many other places in Tanakh, to just prepare, to arm oneself, to ready oneself, without any particular number involved. And that is what Onkelos translates it at. Onkelos is the Aramaic translation of the Bible. And it's what many of the commentators agree with him. It was saying, Joseph wasn't saying a particular figure. He wasn't trying to give that precise of an analysis. He might need to look at the books of Egypt before he could tell him a particular number. But what he is trying to do is say, prepare. Just in general, we need to prepare in order to make the best of the bounty. Make sense? Okay. Onward with Radak.
Pharaoh approved of Joseph's suggestion, as did his ministers, as they all understood that it was a wise and practical plan.
Okay, so two things I want to point out in Radak's commentary here. One is it's much easier to recognize a wise and practical plan after someone else has come up with it, rather than coming up with it on your own. And that's not to our shame, right? We can appreciate great art. We can appreciate great inventions without having to invent them ourselves. That doesn't mean we're dummies. It just means we should be able to recognize what is wise and good when it's in front of us, even if we couldn't have created it on our own. The second is also, this is a slight mitigation of the other interpreters and wise people, which is they may or may not still believe Joseph. But what they do believe is that this is a decent plan to go ahead with, even if it turns out he's wrong. Because that's the problem here, is what happens if he's wrong? His interpretation is 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, and he's telling us this crazy idea of saving more of the food. Well, yeah, and if he's wrong, we just have extra food. So that's one of the reasons why they're willing to go along with this young Hebrew slave who was in prison, is because what he's proposing makes good sense generally. No downside if he happens to be mistaken.
And if he's mistaken, and he's that young Jewish guy, that, it's not one of them.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And if he's right, they don't starve to death. Hey, it's win-win for everybody. It's very political in their answers. Okay, but there's more that's going on here, which is why I brought the Akedat Yitzchak commentary, than just good political advice or good economic planning. So this is a much longer quote, but I've taken the excerpts I think we need for today.
In order to make use of one's eyesight, light is indispensable. Even possession of perfect eyesight is useless, since one is unable to translate one's potential into the actual unless the objects to be seen are bathed in light. None of our other senses requires external phenomena to enable them to function. One can smell in the dark, touch in the dark, etc.
All right. So first I want to make sure his metaphor is clear, because it's a beautiful metaphor, very stirring, which is vision, unlike every other sense we have, needs an external component or it won't work. My listening is entirely internal to myself. I suppose we could stretch it a bit and say if you're in a vacuum, you can't hear anything. But let's be honest, how often does that circumstance come up? And if you are in a vacuum, how long will you still be alive in order to wonder about, why am I not hearing anything? Yeah, it's the least of your problems, to say the least. It happens within you, right? Your nerves are within you for your touch, for your taste, and for smell. The ear, but eyes, if I close my eyes, my vision is useless. No, my vision's not great to begin with, but if I close my eyes, or if we go into pitch blackness, my vision is completely useless. So there is a skill and an asset that is dependent on something external to itself in some unique way. So that's the metaphor that he's trying to and now he's going to shift that to wisdom.
Because the sense of vision requires light in order to function, light is also called wisdom, seeing that wisdom is also an external agent assisting all our senses to improve the quality of their respective perceptions.
All right, so all of you should be going, what? Wisdom is an external agent? What are you talking about? Right? I'm wise. There's not wisdom there that, like light beams, comes in and makes my vision work. Right? My wisdom is mine. Right? I'm the smart person. And what he's trying to argue here is that, yes, we have intellect, and yes, we have cleverness and intelligence and all those good things, but wisdom is an external component to our true understanding of the world beyond just what we're able to figure out with our own monkey mind. And that is what makes our skill, our ability, our intellect so powerful and so amazing. But if we lack wisdom, right, if that wisdom has not been added to us from this external source, meaning from God in general, but also through Torah and through study and the building up of wisdom because of the resources around us, like what we're doing here today, good is this? Right? This is just a really, really good computer that can't actually figure out what is right or wrong to do. It can do math. It can figure out trajectories if I want to throw the pen. Not perfectly, but do pretty well, and in the hands of someone else, probably better. But it can't really figure out, do I want to throw the pen? What should I write on the board? Why are we studying this today? What should that requires wisdom in order to guide and illuminate, if you will, my own intellect. Does that make sense? Right. So for understanding what's happening with Joseph, Akedat Yitzchak says we need to have that vision, if you will. Go ahead. Onward.
Solomon also describes the relationship of light to darkness as like the relationship of wisdom to foolishness, explaining that the fool, though he sees, walks in darkness, whereas the wise, even though blind, carries the source of light in his head.
Right? That if you're really understanding, not just clever, but really wise, even if your eyes are dim and dark, you still understand, you still see what needs to be, what is in the world. Right? And a fool, even though you're walking in daylight, even though you've got all the light in the world around you, if you're not using it, you might as well be in darkness. Got the metaphor still running? Okay. Onward, one last section.
Basing ourselves on this comparison between eyesight and wisdom, the Torah's statement that Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of his servants is clear. It means that people who had up to now walked in darkness suddenly were greatly enlightened. In the final analysis, providing spiritual enlightenment to those walking in spiritual darkness is what the interpretation of dreams is all about. The ability to relate apparently unconnected phenomenon to one another, the future amounts to.
All right, so we'll come back to that last sentence in just a second, but the idea that why would God have sent this in a dream to Pharaoh, right? Well, what's the point of that? Is, and Akidat's Yitzhak's opinion is, one, is because it gives God a chance to shine a little light on Pharaoh, where he currently didn't have any, precisely because he will need this external force, in this case Joseph, to illuminate what is actually going on. And that opportunity for a dream to lead to additional spiritual enlightenment is one of the reasons why this mode of information is being used in the story, rather than God just saying, Pharaoh, build a granary, right? That would not give spiritual enlightenment. That would just give planning instructions. But this opportunity for opening up and shedding some light into the darkness of Egypt, it chose the vehicle of the dream. And this last line is just so beautifully crafted and as almost modern of an idea of, if you want to know what it means to predict the future, you have to understand all the things that look unrelated around you. And when you see all the things that look unrelated and how they actually relate, what's going to happen tomorrow. But if you look at everything as just being different and disconnected and nothing underlying holding them together, no wisdom that pulls your view into focus, then yeah, you're going to stumble around, even though it's clear all around you, right? All the things, everything you need to know what's going to happen tomorrow is already in front of you today. And if you can't figure out what's going to happen tomorrow, it means you just aren't trying hard enough and don't have enough wisdom to understand how they really relate. Good? Yes? Good. Onward.
The reason why Pharaoh felt he needed the consent of his ministers before appointing Joseph to such a position was the well-known animosity harbored by Egyptians generally against any Hebrew. The appointment to a position with such wide-ranging powers was something extraordinary, even if Joseph had not been a slave and a Hebrew to boot.
All right, so again, this actually should have come before this last paragraph, but I apparently made a mistake. But it's reinforcing the image of what it meant for Joseph to be given this position in general, and also because of his Hebrew background.
Hebrew slave.
Yes. Now, the Talmud has a lot to say about dreams in general, and I've abbreviated the most famous section from Brachot on it, but hopefully some of it will grab our attention. Question first.
This kind of struck me because I didn't realize there was such negative connotations about Hebrews prior to everybody coming down. I mean, how much exposure was there? What?
Well, historically, we know there was quite a lot, and we know from even Egyptian sources that the people who came, what we would call the Semites, as opposed to the African Egyptians, were looked down upon greatly in Egyptian society. But we have another example even from the Bible, which is when Mrs. Potiphar is accusing Joseph. What is one of the most damning phrases she uses against him? That Hebrew that he brought into our house, right? It's not just that it was a slave. She uses the term Hebrew as though it was a racial pejorative, be the equivalent of using one of the, unfortunately, many racial terms that people have when they're being bigoted. Hebrew. So I guess actually in the modern sense, we can even go, he brought that Jew, right? And you can tell when someone uses the term Jew, not to mean a person who happens to practice Judaism, but as being used as a racial epithet. That we already see.
One of my lawyers
Yeah.
But their
Some of my
explanation,
best friends.
this goes back to the verse of Noah, the inclination of their heart was still evil. And
Well,
if they're somewhat xenophobic,
yes.
that's part, that's their animalistic nature.
Well, the xenophobia is not actually animalistic. That seems to be fairly endemic to human, especially the human empires. But
They're, that person's not of my family, not of my neighborhood, not of my tribe.
yes, the us and them conflict, indeed, is definitely still going on in Egypt. And it seems that Joseph is a useful light to sort of crack the veneer of how they should perceive these Hebrews, these people from over there, because he can do something they can't, and he is going to help them at the same time that they will then watch the rest of the world around them suffering from all their deprivations. So they are going to owe a lot to this Hebrew, which is partly what makes the backlash, the reactionaryism of the Pharaoh who comes in Shemot, the rights of the Hebrews, so painful. Because this is a moment where the door has been cracked open. We have a moment of tolerance. We have a moment of integration. He marries this daughter of Potiphara, a priest of the Egyptians. It looks almost as though the Egyptians are opening to the idea that the Semites are not all bad, horrible, sheep people. And then it slams shut, and we're plunged into slavery, darkness, and murder. So it is a real painful historical lesson that sometimes you can get a toe in the door, cutting off the foot. But hopefully we, at least 3,000 years later, have learned that that's not the correct behavior. But unfortunately, the Egyptians, we know because we've read ahead, are not quite there. But they had a glimmer. They had a glimmer, which is also partly why they are more responsible for their treatment of our ancestors, because they knew the good we could do for them and had done for them. How dare they treat us the way they did? Okay, on to the Talmud.
And said Rav Chisda, a dream left without interpretation is like a letter left unread. A good dream is never fully realized, and a bad dream is never fully realized.
Right, so this is a general theme that comes that, dreams are dreams, and there are, but don't take them as being a perfect news article of what actually is happening or happened. Right, the visions, the dreams, for crying out loud. That there's stuff in them and they need to be interpreted. Don't just say, it's only a dream. Do try to think about it and dwell on it if it feels important to you, but also don't overly dwell on every single aspect and think that everything is important, because no good dream has ever come to pass perfectly, and no bad dream ever comes to pass perfectly.
And said Rav Chisda, a bad dream is better than a good dream. And said Rav Chisda, as to a bad dream, the sadness that it causes is enough for it. And as to a happy dream, the pleasure that it causes is enough for it.
So, beautiful view of the psychology. If you think that a bad dream is coming to warn you of some punishment or to warn you of some calamity, the worry that you have because of the bad dream is punishment enough. Right? And if you have a good dream that you think is blessing you with some future prosperity, and that you feel great joy and uplift, and you're so happy because of the thought of whatever you think the dream has promised you, you have now eaten up the reward of whatever the dream was promising you in your daydream, if you will, of your fantasy of that dream. So both for our dark fantasies and our positive fantasies, thinking about them is actually the content in many cases. And the content, the calamity or the reward we thought we were getting, to generate the emotions. And if that is not a brilliant statement about human psychology, that often what we feel about an event is more important than the event itself, then I don't know how you could get greater wisdom and insight from 2,000 years ago. Questions, comments on that? Okay.
Said Rav Berachia, even though part of it may come true, the whole of it will never come true. How do we know it? From the case of Joseph, for it is written, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down to me. But at that time, his mother was no longer alive.
Right. So even when he had his first dreams, you can't say that his dreams were perfectly accurate and true, because his mother was never going to come and bow before him, because his mother was already gone. And if you weren't sure that his mother was represented by the moon, Jacob himself interprets that as being his mother. So it's pretty clear that that was what the dream almost certainly meant. However, that dream did have a very important function, one that we alluded to earlier on.
Said Rev Levy, a person should always keep the hope that a good dream will come true, even for 22 years. How do we know it? It is from the case of Joseph.
Right? How long was it from when Joseph was sold till his brothers were bowing before him?
You say 22.
22 years. Well, we actually know the math, right? Because he was abducted when he was 17. It says that he's brought before Pharaoh when he's 30, right? Which means that that was 13 years that he spent as a slave, right? Or 13 years a slave in prison, right? Two of those years were in prison. And then how many years of plenty?
7.
And then how many years in the famine before his brothers show up? 2, right? 22 years. So Joseph spent 22 years hoping, dreaming that his dream would become fulfilled.
Okay, so that makes him, that's why they couldn't recognize him at all.
Oh yeah,
Not only his
the last time they
dress,
saw him was 17,
Yeah,
and
the
now
last
he's
time-
39.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was not easily recognizable to people who hadn't seen me since high school
Right.
when I was 39. Yeah, you'd seen me a few times in between. Whereas, and by the way, on that point, so very understandable of why he could recognize his brothers, because they were already young men,
Yeah.
right? They were already mature and only getting older, which is usually easier to track once you've got that full mature face going.
And they had changed their clothes as many times.
And they still smelled like the sheep.
But also, just hearing you expound on that makes much more sense of why he thinks this was, you bear no responsibility, this was all meant to be, because he already knew from his dream that stuff would have to happen to get to this point. So when it happens, he could see the connection, whereas we look at it and say,
But did he know? Did he know that there was going to be a downfall?
But no, but
Right.
He knew
But
someplace-
when this is happening,
Hmm.
then he can say, all
That's what
this
it meant.
had to happen to
Right.
bring to this. Because had we just all grown up together for 22 years, nobody would be bowing at my feet.
Well, so that's where Joseph, in the end, reinterprets, in my opinion, his dream. Because at the end, when his brothers are there and they're all reconciled, and he gives that statement of this was God's plan, and that's why you sold me, I bear you no ill will. That's somebody who has reinterpreted his dream to say, this was bound to take 22 years. When he was a 17-year-old and he was daddy's favorite, and he was the firstborn of the favorite wife, there was every probability and reason to expect that he would become his father's successor, and that his brothers would indeed bow to him. Not that they were supposed to, but that Joseph might become the patriarch of a family where he would demand his brothers' submission, not only their allegiance. And
Well, is it a reinterpretation?
as a 17-year-old, he may not have been thinking,
Right.
they will eventually come to me and I will be gracious to them. He may have been thinking, eventually I'm going to be in charge of all of this, meaning the herds and the flocks.
Although I don't really see it as reinterpreted.
Yeah.
He has grown so much.
Yes.
He has changed so much that now as he looks at the dream, he
Ah.
better understands it
Right. So
than he did as a 17-year-old. And we're all like that. We understand, we can look back and say, oh, yeah.
it's almost as though he has more wisdom now, more light to understand that vision.
But that was going to be my question. Does that argue for the fact that when he's been an older, more mature man, he now has a level of wisdom that he's in understanding the wise and discernment
Right.
that he simply did not have before.
Yes.
And this gift of the visions, without the wisdom, it can be rather problematic.
Yeah. And in fact, he misses in his own interpretation the biggest clue that it was going to take a long time. Right? Because remember, he never interprets it perfectly himself. He never says to his brothers, I have this dream, this is what it is. He tells them his dreams. They interpret it. Do you plan to rule over us? Do you plan to be sovereign over us? Right? They give this double form. And then his father says, do you expect us to bow to? There's this feeling of the dream as being you're ruling over us. Cute, because, you know, he probably likes the idea of being in charge. But what is actually at the core of that dream? What have all the numbers meant up until this point? In the baker, when we have, you know, the number 3.
Periods of time.
Periods of time, right? How many stars are bowing to Joseph? Brothers, right?
Right.
22 years,
Right.
right? He had double dreams,
Right.
right? Which were actually dreams, and they were always referred to as more than one dream, as opposed to Pharaoh, whose 2 dreams were actually 1. Joseph's 2 dreams were actually 2. 22 years later, if he had only focused on the fact that his brothers were not the brothers bowing to him, but 11 years were going to pass twice before he would be in that position. And rather than getting caught up in who's in charge, he would have understood in 22 years, I'm going to stand in a position where I can support my brothers. Where their grain, remember, their grain will be fallen and mine will be good. That's exactly the position that he stands in. Not ruling over them, but being in a position to help them. In 22 years, he will be in a unique position to help his family. But instead, everyone got caught up in the power dynamic and focused on who's bowing to whom, rather than the meat of the idea, which was 22 years from now, there's going to be a catastrophe, and we're going to need Joseph to help us.
But he relates his dreams. He doesn't interpret them.
No,
I didn't think so.
no, he doesn't. And he's too young. He doesn't have the wisdom. He doesn't have the wisdom to keep his mouth shut, let alone to actually see what they mean.
Rabbi, so if the 11 doesn't mean the 11 brothers,
Right.
but it means years, what would the sun and moon be in that interpretation?
Well, you can go back to Brachot and say the sun and the moon, those were the chaff, right? Those are that's actually how they translate it here, right? There's some part that will never come true. The term that's used in is chaff. It's those extra pieces, like the mother wasn't actually part of the dream.
Right.
And his father, by the way, never bows to his son,
Right.
right? So there's always an element of the dream that is just the wrapping.
Couldn't you say the sun and the moon, that's times 2? Instead of double
Sure,
dreams?
we can do that if you like. we can do that if you like.
There's the multiplier.
Right.
That's right.
Which is why we don't rely on dreams a priori, right, from the beginning to predict and to plan for tomorrow. Instead, we do what Akedat Yitzchak said at the very end, which is we try to see how things are connected in order that we can predict the future. And we try to take steps, as the Radak also mentioned, that would be considered wise and practical in order to plan ahead. And we try to make the best of the years we have in the event that the years in the future may not be so perfect. And that is wisdom that doesn't need a particular dream in order to be effective. But sometimes in hindsight, we can see that it did all work out, even though it wasn't the way we expected. And in the meantime, we can still eat from the joy of that good dream and allow that to sustain us until such times as things start to look brighter. And that's certainly been the story of our people for an awfully long time. And we continue to make sure we have good dreams and keep planning for the future. Questions, comments? Okay. Hanukkah Sameach.